Okay, gang, let's spend a few minutes talking about everyone's favorite tax, the income tax. And let's begin with looking at this slightly fuzzy chart. And if you can make out the dates on the bottom, see if you can take a wild guess when the income tax began. It's not too hard to pick that out, is it? The income tax starts about 1913. It passes, it comes into effect in 1914, just in time for World War. The income tax was complicated from the very beginning. Here's a photograph of people filing their income taxes in 1920, fairly early in that whole process. Here's actually a shot of the first tax return from Franklin Roosevelt when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Wilson. And this is a little bit hard to make out, but what you can see is the very bottom line is that his total taxable income was only about $900, or a little less than $1,000, $989, and it looks like 67 cents on a total income of $14,229. So you can see that a lot of his income was exempt even back then for various reasons that are not entirely clear to me. A lot of it was dividends and interest, I guess. Now, when the income tax began, the top rate was 7% on incomes above $500,000. Now, that's about $11 million in today's money if you adjust it for inflation. So in other words, the tax rate was low and it only affected very high incomes. But then along comes World War I, and it was decided that we needed to generate a lot of revenue for the war right away, and rates went up very sharply. So here's a chart that shows the long-term highest and lowest marginal income tax rates from the beginning of the modern income tax in 1913. And you can see that the rate began very low in its first couple of years, but then along comes World War I. And the Congress and President Wilson decided that the best way to pay for the war was to run up the income tax to very high levels. And there you can see the first big spike in income tax rates, almost up to 80%. On the highest incomes during World War I. And remember that it would be a lot of brackets, and while people think about the rate on the highest incomes, rates went up on everybody down the ladder. And so suddenly everybody was caught up in the income tax, and not just the richest Americans. Then in the 1920s, you had the first of the tax cutting experiments under President Coolidge and Andrew Mellon. We'll talk more about this when we consider the whole supply side economics phenomenon later in the course. But it's not an accident probably that tax reduction coincides with the booming economy of the Roaring '20s. Then came the Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt and the liberalism in the saddle wanted to soak the rich, and you got the rates that were up over 93%. At one point in World War II, Franklin Roosevelt proposed a 100% income tax rate on all incomes above $25,000. That proposal didn't get very far. Then you saw the Kennedy tax rate reductions of the early 1960s, which again coincided with a great economic boom and a great investment boom. And then we see here the Reagan tax cuts of the 1980s, which again coincide with a great economic boom. And then finally, here at the very end are the Bush tax cuts. And the amazing thing is, these are the ones that everybody's all upset about right now, especially President Obama and liberals who say they want to repeal the Bush tax cuts and take us back to the Clinton-era rates of about 39% on the top. And it's really quite amazing when you look at those earlier tax rate changes that we're fighting over such a small change in the tax rate. Now, there's a lot we'll be talking about later on about income taxes, but for now, there's a simple lesson if you go back to that chart of World War I tax rates. And the simple lesson is, never believe the government when they tell you that a tax is going to start small and stay small and only affect a small number of people. That lasted for less than 18 months in the case of the income tax. And so when you hear proposals for a value-added tax or a carbon tax or an energy tax of some kind, along with promises that, oh, it will only be a small amount and surely it will stay small, well, the record on the most hated tax of all is that you simply can't believe a pledge of that kind. Well, I'll have more to say about this later on, but for now, file away these charts on income tax rates and keep them in mind as you follow the debates about tax rates and tax policy, and we'll be back in a little while.